An arrogant and powerful CEO faces another ordinary day until a desperate young woman appears in front of his building begging for help. Richard Sterling, used to seeing only numbers and business, drives the beggar away without a second thought, ordering security to remove her from his property. But when the mysterious girl removes her cap, revealing not only a bald skull ravaged by cancer but also a tattoo that will completely shatter his world, Richard will discover that some past decisions can come back to haunt him in ways even all his money can't fix. What happens when a man who chose success over family realizes it may be too late to recover what really mattered?
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
The Patek Philippe clock struck exactly 6 in the morning when Richard Sterling opened his eyes in the penthouse, occupying the top 3 floors of the most expensive building in the Upper East Side. Not even the alarm dared to interrupt his routine. His body had conditioned itself to wake at the exact time, like a machine calibrated to perfection. The Italian marble shower poured water heated to exactly 98 degrees Fahrenheit over his broad shoulders, as Richard mentally planned every move of the day. At 52, he maintained the upright posture of a general and the cold determination of someone who had never experienced a defeat that could not be turned into a victory. The charcoal gray Armani suit fit his athletic body perfectly, result of 2 hours daily in the building's private gym. The Italian silk tie was tied with the precision of a ritual, each fold calculated to project absolute authority. At 7:15, the private elevator took him directly to the 40th floor of Sterling Industries, where Manhattan stretched out like a chessboard through the panoramic windows of his office. The aroma of specially roasted Colombian coffee hung in the air. His secretary, Margaret, knew he expected the steaming cup on his desk at the exact moment of his arrival. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Margaret whispered, her footsteps muffled on the Persian carpet as she placed the leather folder with the morning reports. At 60, she had learned to anticipate his every need, moving through the room like an efficient shadow. Richard did not even lift his eyes from the documents. His long fingers slid through the pages at the speed of someone devouring information like oxygen. "Hartman Corp shares dropped 3 points at the opening," he murmured, his deep voice echoing through the mahogany-paneled room. "I want a full analysis on my desk in 20 minutes. "It is already being prepared, sir." Margaret hesitated for a moment, her nervous eyes resting on the cream-colored envelope she held. "Mr. Sterling, an invitation arrived for your nephew Michael's wedding. The ceremony will be next month in Chicago." The silence that followed was as sharp as a blade. Richard finally raised his steel-blue eyes, which glowed with an arctic coldness. "Michael?" The name left his lips as if it tasted bitter. "I have no nephew, Margaret. You should know that after 15 years working for me." "But sir, he's your sister, Sarah's son." "I have no sister." The words were spoken with terrifying calmness, each syllable cutting the air like shattering crystal. Richard stood up, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the desk. "Family is a distraction. A luxury men like me cannot afford. Relationships are chains that bind the weak to the ground while the strong soar toward success." Margaret swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she put away the invitation. "How many times do I need to repeat this?" Richard walked to the window, watching the tiny cars move through the avenues below like obedient ants. "I cut those ties years ago for a reason. Feelings make people predictable, vulnerable, and vulnerable men do not build empires." "Understood, sir." The intercom on his desk emitted a soft beep. The voice of his executive assistant came through the speaker. "Mr. Sterling, the executives from Morrison Holdings have arrived. They are waiting in the meeting room on the 38th floor." Richard adjusted his shirt cuffs, every movement deliberate and controlled. This would be the acquisition that would consolidate his dominance in the medical technology sector. $47 million that would transform Morrison Holdings into just another division of Sterling Industries. "Margaret, I want you to cancel all my appointments after lunch," he said, walking toward the door with firm steps echoing like a hammer striking an anvil. "This meeting may run long, and I will not allow interruptions when I am closing a deal of this magnitude." "Yes, Mr. Sterling." He stopped at the threshold, his hand resting on the golden doorknob. For a moment, something seemed to cross his expression, a fleeting shadow, too quick to interpret, and Margaret, his voice lowered a tone, almost whispering, "Get rid of that invitation." I don't want to see family paper polluting my office again. Understood, sir. Richard Sterling left the room with the confidence of a conqueror marching into battle. His Italian shoes hammered on the marble hallway as employees moved aside, slightly bowing their heads in fearful reverence. In the elevator, as the floor numbers decreased, he adjusted his tie one last time and checked the gold Rolex on his wrist. In exactly 43 minutes, Morrison Holdings would be his. One more trophy for his collection. Another step on the infinite ladder of power. The elevator's air conditioning blew gently, but Richard Sterling felt neither cold nor heat. He was a force of nature disguised as a man, moving through the business world like a controlled hurricane, leaving only success and devastation in his wake. The biting cold of February in Manhattan bit through the thin fabric of the suit as Richard Sterling walked through the revolving doors of the Sterling Industries building. The chilly wind of Fifth Avenue whipped his face, but he barely registered the discomfort. His mind was already in the meeting room, calculating every move of the upcoming negotiation. The marble of the external stairs gleamed under the winter sun when something caught his peripheral attention: a hunched figure by the granite columns of the main entrance. A young woman, appearing to be in her early 20s, was leaning against the wall, a faded wool cap pulled over dark eyes that seemed too large for her pale, thin face. "Excuse me." Her voice was a hoarse whisper, almost lost in the noise of traffic. She took a trembling step towards him, gloved hands and threadbare gloves timidly extended. "Please, sir, I need help." Richard stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing with irritation. The Rolex on his wrist read 8:42. He had exactly 18 minutes to get to the meeting, and he would not tolerate delays. "Girl, you are on Sterling Industries' private property." His voice cut through the cold air like a sharp blade. "Leave immediately before I call security." But she did not move. Instead, she took another unsteady step forward, and Richard could see her lips were bluish from the cold, her whole body trembling under the thin, torn coat hanging loosely on her shoulders. I'm not an ordinary beggar," she whispered, breath forming small clouds of vapor in the cold air. "I'm sick. I need money for medicine. Just $50, please." Indignation burned in Richard's chest like acid. $50? As if he was some fool falling for street scams? His fingers clenched around the leather briefcase as he took an aggressive step toward her. "You have 30 seconds to disappear from my sight before I have you arrested for trespassing," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't care what your situation is. Find another sucker for your act." Tears began to run down her face, leaving shiny trails on her pale skin. She swayed, leaning against the granite column, and Richard could see that her hands trembled violently, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, more desperate. "You don't understand," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I'm not just any stranger. You should remember me. You should." "Security." Richard's voice echoed through the building's entrance like thunder. Two uniformed men immediately emerged from the main doors, their heavy footsteps pounding the marble as they approached. Richard didn't even look at them, his steel blue eyes fixed on the young woman with a coldness that could freeze hell. "Remove this person from my property immediately," he ordered, his words slipping between clenched teeth. "And make sure the entrance security knows she is banned from approaching this building again." "No." The young woman tried to move toward him, but her legs failed and she almost fell. "Please, just listen to me. If you knew who I am, if you remembered." "Mr. Sterling," one of the security guards said, extending his hands toward the young woman. "We'll take care of this immediately." The black limousine slid silently to the curb, its engine whispering almost inaudibly. The driver jumped out and opened the rear door, the golden light from inside contrasting with the gray chill of the New York morning. Richard walked toward the vehicle without a single glance back, his Italian shoes clicking on the wet asphalt with military precision. But her voice followed him, growing in desperation as the guards held her by the arms. "Richard Sterling," she shouted now, her voice echoing between the tall buildings like a lament. "You can't just pretend you don't know who I am. You can't erase the past like that." He paused for a fraction of a second at the limousine door, his fingers squeezing the golden handle until his knuckles turned white. Something, perhaps a distant echo, a shadow of memory touched the edge of his consciousness like a cold breeze. But then he shook his head sharply, brushing away any hesitation as if it were irritating smoke. The biting February wind whipped down Fifth Avenue as the young woman, in one last desperate gesture, raised her trembling hands and tore the wool cap from her head. The faded fabric flew through the air like a dead leaf, revealing not only a completely bald skull, pale skin where golden curls should have been, but something that made Richard Sterling's world stop spinning. At the nape of her neck, dark against the translucent skin, a tattoo in Gothic letters screamed silently, "Daddy." Richard, who already had one foot inside the limousine, froze. His fingers gripped the door so tightly that his knuckles turned white as marble. The air rushed out of his lungs all at once, as if someone had punched him in the stomach. Two number. It can't be. The memory hit him like a runaway trainer room bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Walls covered with certificates and trophies, the scent of leather and oak from his old home office. A 16-year-old girl, golden hair cascading over her shoulders, nervously shifting from one foot to the other. "Daddy, close your eyes. I have a surprise for you." The voice echoed in his mind like a reverberation from a lost time. "Promise you won't get mad." And then she had turned, sweeping her hair aside to show the freshly made tattoo, still red and swollen from the tattoo artist's needle. Her eyes shone with childish pride and unconditional love. "So you know I'm yours forever, Daddy. No matter what happens." Emma. The name slipped from his lips like a broken prayer, a whisper loaded with 5 years of lost life. She turned around, and for the first time he saw her face in full. The same emerald green eyes that had stared at him from the cradle 25 years ago, now deep and dull from illness. The high cheekbones where once there had been rosy, healthy cheeks. But it was her. His daughter. His little Emma. "Daddy?" Her voice was a thread of hope woven into sound, so fragile it could break from the faintest breath of wind. The world collapsed. Richard Sterling, the man who had never shown weakness before senators or corporate presidents, who had faced financial crises that toppled empires without shedding a tear, fell to his knees on the icy pavement of the sidewalk. The leather briefcase slipped from his hands, scattering million-dollar documents into the wind like insignificant confetti. "Emma! Emma!" His scream tore through the morning air like the howl of a wounded animal, echoing between Manhattan's skyscrapers. People stopped on the sidewalks, looking with curiosity and astonishment at the powerful CEO kneeling in the street. But she was crumbling. Her knees gave way and she began to fall, the skeletal body no longer able to stand. The torn coat fluttered around her like the broken wings of a bird. Richard crawled across the asphalt, his knees scraping the rough concrete, his $3,000 suit shredding as he tried to reach her before she touched the ground. His hands, which for years had known only the gentle touch of leather and silk, were now bloodied and scratched. "My girl, my little girl." He managed to catch her in his arms just inches before she hit the asphalt, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. Emma was too light in his arms, her body fragile like a porcelain doll about to shatter. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on his face with difficulty. "I knew," she whispered, her cold hand touching his face with the lightness of a feather. "I knew you would remember the tattoo. What did they do to you?" Richard sobbed, tears streaming freely down his face, falling on her pale cheeks. "My daughter! What did they do to my daughter?" The security guards stopped a few meters away, paralyzed by the scene. The driver had stepped out of the limousine and stood there, stunned. People began to gather, whispering and pointing. But Richard saw nothing but the face ravaged by disease of the daughter he had banished from his life 5 years ago. Emma tried to smile, but even that small effort seemed to drain all her remaining energy. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice fading like smoke in the cold wind. I tried so hard to be strong, like you taught me." And then her eyes closed, and Richard Sterling held in his arms not a business prize or a corporate trophy, but the broken wreckage of all the love he had rejected in the name of success. Time shattered like broken glass as Richard held Emma's fragile body. Present and past collided in his mind like furious waves, each memory a stab in the chest. August 2019. The mansion in Westchester County. The scent of roses from Emma's mother's garden drifting through the open windows. "Dad, I need to talk to you," Emma had said, her small hands nervously playing with the hem of the blue dress he had bought her in Paris. At 17, she was his most precious jewel, the only person in the world who could make him genuinely smile. Richard had left the company documents on the mahogany table. All his attention turned to her. At that time, Emma was the priority. Always was. "Of course, Princess. What is it?" She had taken a deep breath, gathering courage, and said the words that would shatter everything between them. "Dad, I'm a lesbian. And this is my girlfriend, Sophia." A young Latina with curly hair had timidly emerged from behind the door, her dark eyes full of hope and fear. Richard had looked at the two of them, the world around him collapsing like a house of cards. Now, on the cold asphalt of Manhattan, Emma weakly coughed in his arms, blood painting her lips dark red. The brutal reality of the present intertwined with memories like a macabre dance. "Ambulance!" Richard shouted to the security guards, his voice breaking. "Call an ambulance now!" But his mind was prisoner of the past. His voice had been pure ice that August night. "Get out of my house," he had whispered, each word a fired bullet. "You are not my daughter. Dad, please," Emma had begged, tears streaming down her young face. "I'm still me. I'm still your Emma. Nothing has changed." "Everything has changed." He had exploded, his fury filling the room like a hurricane. "Do you think I'll let my reputation be destroyed? That I'll allow people to whisper about Richard Sterling and his wayward daughter?" Sophia had pulled Emma by the hand, trying to protect her from the storm of rage, but Emma resisted, desperate. "Dad, I need you. You're all I have left in the world." "You made your choice," Richard had snarled, turning his back on her. "Now live with the consequences. I want you out of my house before dawn, and never come back." In the present, a distant siren began to echo among the buildings, approaching slowly. Emma opened her eyes, struggling to focus on her devastated father's face. "I came back so many times," she whispered, each word a Herculean effort. "Remember Christmas 2020? I stayed outside the gate for 6 hours in the freezing rain. December 2020. Richard had seen her silhouette through the security cameras. Emma, now 19, thinner, wearing cheap clothes, holding a wrapped present. He had instructed the guards not to let her in, watching from the second-floor window as she stood there, waiting under the rain that slowly turned into snow. "Mr. Sterling," Margaret had whispered that night, entering his office with a cup of hot chocolate. "She brought you a present. The guards can deliver it." "Burn it," he had replied, without looking up from the financial reports. "And tell the guards to call the police if she comes back." Emma kept whispering into the present, her voice a ghostly echo from the past. "And on your birthday, in 2021, I sent that letter, explaining I was working, trying to go to college." The letter had arrived by mail, handwritten on cheap paper. Richard had torn it up without reading, throwing the pieces into the fireplace. But not before seeing the first words. "Dear Dad, I love you more than anything in the world. And when I got sick for the first time," Emma coughed, specks of blood staining Richard's ruined suit. "I called you. You changed the number." Richard's heart shattered into a million fragments. He had changed the number 3 times. Each time she found a way to reach him, he cut another bridge. "In 2022, she continued, her breathing becoming more labored. "I lost my job. Sophia left me. Said she couldn't watch me waste away anymore. And then, the streets." The ambulance rounded the corner, its red and blue lights painting the building's ghostly colors. Paramedics jumped from the vehicle, running with stretchers and equipment. Emma weakly held her father's hand, her blue-tinged nails digging into his skin. 2 years on the streets, Dad," she whispered. 2 years searching for work, for help. When the cancer came back, I had no money for chemotherapy. No one. No one but you. And you. You." Her voice was lost in a sob that echoed like a lament among the skyscrapers. Richard held his daughter against his chest, feeling his heart break definitively as he realized her body weighed barely 40 kilos once she had been robust and full of life, running across the Westchester lawn like a ray of sunshine. "Sir, we need to take her now," a paramedic said, positioning the stretcher beside them. Richard looked at Emma's face, finally seeing not the disappointment he had created in his mind, but the child he had held when she took her first steps, whom he had comforted through nightmares, whom he had called his little princess for 17 precious years. And now she was dying, alone, abandoned, because of him. "Emma," he whispered, helping the paramedics place her on the stretcher. "Daddy's here now. Daddy's here." But even as the words left his mouth, Richard Sterling knew it might already be too late to mend the shards of what he had destroyed. "Forget Morrison Holdings!" Richard roared at the driver as he pushed the paramedics aside and lifted Emma into his arms, carrying her into the limousine. "Mount Sinai Medical Center. Now! And I don't care if you have to run every red light in Manhattan." The limousine's engine purred like a wild feline as the vehicle sped down Fifth Avenue, cutting through traffic with desperate urgency. Richard held Emma against his chest, feeling each labored breath of hers like a dagger to his heart. His hands trembled as he dialed the first number on his phone. "Dr. Matthews? This is Richard Sterling. I need you to cancel everything and go immediately to Mount Sinai. My daughter is dying." His voice broke on the last word, decades of emotional control collapsing like a breached dam. "Richard, I didn't know you had a daw." "It doesn't matter!" he shouted, holding Emma tighter as her body shuddered. "I want the best oncologists in New York at that hospital in 20 minutes. Money is no object. 100 million, 200, whatever it takes." He hung up and immediately dialed another number, his tears blurring the phone screen. "Dr. Rodriguez? Richard Sterling. I need you to mobilize the entire oncology team at Presbyterian right now." "I have a patient with advanced cancer." His voice faltered as he looked at Emma's pale face. "It's my daughter." Emma moved weakly in his arms, her green eyes slowly opening like withered flower petals trying to catch the light. "Daddy," her whisper, was quieter than a butterfly's wings. "I'm here," my princess, Richard sobbed, his tears falling on her face. "Daddy's here and he won't let anything happen to you." Emma tried to smile, but even that small movement seemed to drain all her remaining energy. "I tried so hard," she whispered, each word costing years of her life. "In the last 3 months, when I found out I was dying, I tried to call." Richard closed his eyes tightly, remembering the calls he had told Margaret to block. Unknown numbers that kept trying to reach him. He had thought they were scammers, or worse. Never in his worst nightmares had he imagined it was Emma, his Emma, trying to say goodbye. I changed my name back." "To Sterling," she continued, her breathing becoming more irregular. "When I got sick, I wanted to die as your daughter." "No!" Richard screamed, holding her face between his trembling hands. "You're not going to die. I will get the best doctors in the world. I will cure you, my girl." The phone started ringing incessantly as his contacts returned the calls, but Richard could no longer speak. His throat was closed from pain. Emma raised her skeletal hand and touched his face with a ghostly softness. I went to the building so many times," she whispered, each word a whispered confession in death's confessional. "Security always pushed me away. Until today. I couldn't walk there anymore. Too weak. Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Richard sobbed, kissing her cold forehead. "Why didn't you scream my name from the start? Pride." She smiled weakly, a ghostly echo of the stubborn child he had raised. I inherited your stupid pride, Daddy. I wanted you to recognize me. Not to accept me out of pity." The limousine made a sharp turn off Fifth Avenue, and Emma groaned softly with the movement. Richard adjusted his position, trying to make her more comfortable, but she seemed to be crumbling in his arms like sand. "What have I done?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. "My God, what have I done to my daughter, Daddy?" Emma fought to keep her eyes open, clutching consciousness with tooth and nail. "I just wanted to say goodbye, and that I still love you more than anything in the world." The words came from her like blood from an open wound, carrying all the love, all the pain, all the wasted hope of 5 years of separation. "I love you too," Richard shouted, holding her tightly enough to keep her in the world of the living through sheer willpower. I've always loved you. I was an idiot. A coward. Please, Emma, forgive your stupid dad. Forgive me. But her eyes were already closing again, and her breathing growing more spaced. The body that had once run across the lawns of his estate was shutting down slowly, like a candle flickering out in the wind. Don't leave me, Richard sobbed, holding her as if he could stop her from leaving him forever. Please, baby, don't leave me. Not now that I've found you again. The Mount Sinai Medical Center appeared ahead, its windows shining like a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. But Richard Sterling knew, with the terrifying certainty only a father can have, that he was racing against a clock that perhaps had already stopped a long time ago. And for the first time in his life, all his money, all his power, all his influence meant absolutely nothing in the face of the only thing that truly mattered and that he had thrown away with his own hands. The lobby of Mount Sinai Medical Center had turned into a corporate battlefield. Richard Sterling, his suit torn and stained with Emma's blood, marched back and forth like a general mobilizing troops, his phone pressed to his ear. I want Dr. Yamamoto from Tokyo here in 12 hours, he barked into the phone, his voice echoing through the marble corridors. I don't care if he's operating on the Emperor of Japan. Offer $2 million if necessary. The automatic doors kept opening, allowing a procession of doctors in expensive suits and leather briefcases to enter world-renowned oncologists who had canceled surgeries and conferences to answer Richard Sterling's urgent call. Money spoke, and $5 million per consultation had a very loud voice. Dr. Elizabeth Harris, the hospital's head of oncology, emerged from the ICU wearing a stained lab coat and a grim expression. Her tired eyes met Richard's, who immediately stopped pacing and addressed her like a guided missile. How is she? The words came out like shards of glass. Doctor? Harris took a deep breath, her 30 years of medical experience weighing on every word she chose. Mr. Sterling, you need to sit down for this conversation. I'm not sitting down, Richard growled, planting himself in front of her like an immovable force. Tell me the truth. Everything. The corridor around them seemed frozen in time. Nurses passed silently, avoiding eye contact with the CEO who had turned an entire floor of the hospital into his personal headquarters. The situation is devastating. Doctor, Harris finally said, her words falling like a hammer on an anvil. The adenocarcinoma has spread through the lungs, liver, and bones. Advanced stage 4. Without proper treatment for the last 2 years, malignant cells have practically colonized her body. Richard felt his legs weaken, but forced himself to stay standing. But it can be treated, right? With chemotherapy, radiation. Mr. Sterling, the doctor, interrupted gently, her voice filled with professional compassion. Normally, with a patient at this stage, we would be talking about palliative care. A few weeks, maybe 2 months. No. The word exploded from Richard like a bomb, echoing through the corridors. This is not acceptable. I want experimental treatments, unapproved therapies, anything that exists in the world. At that moment, Dr. Michael Chen, one of Los Angeles' most renowned experimental oncologists, approached the group. His presence had cost Richard $3 million and a private jet to bring him from the West Coast in 4 hours. Mr. Sterling, Dr. Chen said, his calm voice contrasting with the surrounding emotional chaos. I have reviewed all the tests. There is a possibility. A very remote one, but it exists. Richard turned to him like a thirsty man finding water in the desert. Speak. There is an experimental protocol we are testing in Switzerland, Dr. Chen explained, pulling a tablet from his briefcase. Immunotherapy combined with nanotechnology. It has never been attempted in such an advanced case, and the chances are, well, less than 5%. 5% is better than 0, Richard said immediately. How much does it cost? The protocol itself costs about $8 million. But Miss Sterling, you need to understand the risks. The treatment could kill her faster than the cancer itself. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, seeing Emma's face when she was little, running to him with open arms after he returned from business trips. Do it. Now. The next 72 hours became a blur of frantic activity. Richard converted an entire hospital suite into his temporary office, selling properties over the phone between medical consultations. The Westchester Mansion $12 million, the Miami Penthouse $8 million. Sterling Industries, stock 50 million. Margaret appeared periodically with contracts to sign, her eyes red from crying. For the first time in 15 years, she saw her boss completely human, completely broken. Mr. Sterling, she whispered on the third night, finding him sleeping in an uncomfortable chair beside the ICU. I sold everything as instructed. There is enough money for any treatment she needs. Thank you, Margaret, he murmured without opening his eyes. And Margaret, if my daughter ever asks, tell her I was here. I have always been here. The surgery lasted 9 hours. Richard sat in the waiting room like a marble statue, his eyes fixed on the double doors that separated his daughter from life or death. Executives tried to contact him. The stock market was panicking over massive sales of Sterling Industries shares, but he had turned off all phones. Nothing else mattered except that door and the girl on the other side. When Dr. Harris finally emerged, her hands still trembling slightly from the tension, Richard leapt from his chair. She is alive, the doctor said quickly, seeing the terror in his eyes. The surgery was successful beyond our expectations. We managed to remove 80% of the primary tumor mass. Richard collapsed back into the chair, tears of relief streaming down his face. Can I see her? She is still under anesthesia, but yes. And Mr. Sterling. Dr. Harris paused, a small smile touching her tired lips. She murmured your name during the surgery. Several times. Even unconscious, she knew you were here. When Richard entered the ICU, Emma looked too small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that blinked and whispered, keeping her anchored to life. He approached slowly, as if she were made of glass and could break at the slightest noise. Then, her eyes opened, green like emeralds, but now with a spark of life that had been absent for so long. The only sound in the ICU was the constant beep of the heart monitors when Emma finally found the strength to speak, her words cutting the silence like sharp blades. 5 years, Dad, she whispered, her green eyes fixed on the ceiling, avoiding his gaze. I waited 5 years, hoping that maybe, just maybe, you would call on my birthday. Richard felt each word like a punch in the stomach. His hands trembled as he adjusted the chair closer to the bed, wanting to be near but feeling the abyss he himself had dug between them. Emma, I know, her voice, still weak, carried an authority he hadn't expected. Now you listen. For 5 years you had your voice. Now it's my turn. The silence that followed weighed tons. Richard nodded slowly, preparing to hear the truth that had escaped for so long. Emma slowly turned her head toward him, and he could see that behind the physical weakness there was a strength she had developed, surviving alone on the cruelest streets in the world. In the first year she began, her voice gaining strength as the words flowed. I lived in Sophia's car, an old Honda Civic that barely worked. When winter came, we slept in shelters when we could get spots. When we couldn't, well, New York in winter spares no one. Richard closed his eyes, imagining his daughter, his little princess, shivering in a cold car while he slept comfortably in his heated mansion. Sophia lasted 8 months, Emma continued, each word a hammer pounding on his heart. She loved me, Dad. She really loved me. But seeing the person you love waste away, beg for food, be rejected at every job interview because she has no fixed address, it corrodes the soul. Silent tears streamed down Richard's face, but he made no sound, respecting her right to speak. When she left me, I didn't blame her, Emma whispered, her own voice breaking. How could I? I was just a ghost of what I used to be. And besides, carrying the Sterling name on the streets did me no favors. Everyone knew who you were. Some laughed. The daughter of the great Richard Sterling, begging for spare change. Others pitied me. The pity was worse than the laughter. Richard swallowed hard, his throat burning as if he had swallowed ground glass. I changed my name back to Sterling in the 2nd year, she continued, now looking directly into his eyes. You know why? Because even after everything, even after you called me a freak and changed the locks, I was still proud to be your daughter. Stupid, isn't it, Emma? Richard finally found his voice, but it was a broken whisper. I got some small jobs, she said, ignoring his interruption. Cleaning bathrooms, washing dishes. Nothing that lasted long once they found out where I slept. And then, her voice trembled. And then the symptoms started. The cough that never went away. The fatigue. The chest pains. She paused, breathing with difficulty. And Richard could see that even speaking was draining her limited strength. When I finally got enough money to go to a free clinic doctor, it was already too late. "You should have come 2 years ago," he said. "Now we can only do our best to keep you comfortable." "My daughter," Richard sobbed, reaching out to touch her hand, but Emma pulled it away. "No," she said firmly, "you still don't understand, Dad." "In the last 6 months, when I found out I was dying, do you know what I wanted most? It wasn't a warm apartment. It wasn't regular food. It was you. I wanted my father. I wanted to die knowing you didn't hate me." Richard collapsed from the chair, falling to his knees beside the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. "I never hated you," he screamed through the tears. "Never. I was scared." "Scared?" Emma asked, her voice filled with bitter disbelief. "Of what?" "Of everything," Richard confessed, the words pouring out of his soul like a broken dam. "Of what people would say, of what the competitors would whisper in meetings, of what would show up in business magazines." "Richard Sterling, the man who can't even control his own family." Emma stared at him with a mixture of pain and surprise. "You chose strangers over your own daughter?" "I was a coward," Richard admitted, his broken voice echoing through the silent ICU. "A pathetic and insecure man who hid behind money and power because he was terrified of judgment from people who didn't even matter. And in the process, I destroyed the only pure and good thing I ever had in life." He lifted his red, swollen eyes to look at her. "Emma, I was homophobic. I was prejudiced and arrogant and wrong about everything. About you. About what really matters in life. About what makes a person valuable. You were perfect. You are perfect. And I threw away my perfect daughter because I was obsessed with the opinion of people who don't even know my middle name." Emma closed her eyes, silent tears streaming down her pale face. "You kicked me out of the only family I had," she whispered. "Left me alone in the world when I needed you most." "I know," Richard sobbed. "I know, and I will carry that guilt until the day I die. But Emma, my princess, if you give me a chance, just one chance, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. I will learn. I will change. I will become the father you always deserved." Emma opened her eyes slowly, studying the ruined face of the man who had once been her hero and then her worst nightmare. "You think it's that simple?" she asked, her voice heavy with years of accumulated pain. 5 years, Dad. 5 years of hell because you couldn't accept who your daughter really was. "I know it's not simple," Richard whispered. "I know you may never forgive me. And I understand that. But Emma, please, don't die hating me. I couldn't live knowing I lost you twice." Emma was silent for a long moment, the only sound the monitors around her. Finally, she sighed deeply. "I don't hate you, Dad," she said softly. "Hate takes energy, and I spend all my energy just trying to survive. But I also can't just pretend 5 years didn't happen because you finally decided to be a father." Richard nodded slowly, accepting the brutal truth of her words. I need time to process all this," Emma continued, her voice tired. "You say you've changed, that you will change. But Dad, I've heard that before. The night you kicked me out, you said I would always be your daughter. And then you slammed the door in my face." The weight of her words settled between them like a physical barrier. Richard knew there was a long journey ahead if there was any journey at all. His daughter was alive, but the trust between them had died 5 years ago. And as the treatments continued, and the machines whispered around them, father and daughter remained on opposite sides of an abyss that money could not buy, and regret could not easily cross. 6 weeks later, the majestic Westchester County mansion with its meticulously maintained gardens and rooms filled with memories was being appraised by real estate agents. Richard Sterling walked through the corridors where Emma had run as a child, his hands touching the walls as if he were a blind man trying to read Braille. "Mr. Sterling," the lead agent said, consulting his clipboard, "we have 3 offers above the asking price. The property is valued at $15 million, But I can get 18. Accept the highest offer, Richard replied without hesitation, his eyes fixed on the portrait of 10-year-old Emma still hanging on the main staircase. The money needs to be in the account by Monday. The Swiss doctors arrive on Tuesday. Meanwhile, on the 22nd floor of Sterling Industries, a meeting that would forever change the company's culture was taking place. Richard sat at the head of the mahogany table, his eyes as hard as steel scanning the tense faces of the senior executives. "Thomas Miller," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You're fired, effective immediately." Miller, vice president of marketing for 8 years, went pale. "Mr. Sterling, may I know the reason?" At the 2021 Christmas party, you referred to Johnson's assistant as that little fag from the legal department, Richard declared, each word precise like a court verdict. "I thought it was funny at the time. I don't anymore." The silence in the room was deafening. James Patterson, the chief financial officer, cleared his throat nervously. "Richard, maybe we should discuss this in private." "Sandra Wellington," Richard continued, ignoring the interruption. "You're fired too, for consistently refusing to approve partner benefits for employees in same-sex relationships, citing moral issues." "This is ridiculous," Sandra exploded. "You can't fire half the board for." "I can and I will," Richard snarled, standing up with devastating authority. "This company will reflect values I should have embraced years ago. If you can't evolve, you have no place here." Margaret watched from the door, amazed. In 30 years working for Richard Sterling, she had never seen such a radical transformation. The man who once dismissed social issues as political correctness nonsense now embraced them with the same iron intensity he applied to business. At Mount Sinai Medical Center, Emma sat up in bed for the first time in weeks, flipping through newspapers Margaret had brought. Her face was still pale and thin, but color was returning to her cheeks. "Sterling Industries announces $50 million foundation for homeless LGBTQ+ youth," she read aloud, her voice heavy with disbelief. CEO Richard Sterling cites personal experience as motivation. When Richard entered the room an hour later, he found Emma holding the newspaper, her expression unreadable. "Personal experience?" she asked without preamble. Richard stopped at the doorway, his hands clutching a bouquet of white peonies, her favorite flowers since childhood. I meant you. Our situation. You told reporters about me?" "Not in detail," he said quickly, approaching cautiously. "Just that I had learned, through personal circumstances, about the hardships faced by LGBTQ+ youth rejected by their families." Emma studied him for a long moment, her green eyes trying to read the intentions behind his actions. "Is it performative?" she asked directly. "To impress me?" The question hit him like a punch to the stomach. Richard placed the flowers in a nearby vase and sat in the chair that had become permanently his. "Emma," he said calmly, "for the past 3 years, since 2021, I have been in therapy twice a week." She raised her eyebrows, surprised. "Therapy?" "With Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist specializing in family issues and internalized prejudice," he admitted, his hands clasped in his lap. "At first, I went there trying to find ways to fix what had happened. I thought if I could understand where I had failed as a father, I could prevent it from happening again." Emma frowned. "I failed at raising you. I failed at educating you. I was convinced I had done something wrong that made you gay," Richard continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Dr. Mitchell spent 2 years explaining that the only thing I had done wrong was thinking there was something wrong with you. And now I know you were born perfect," he said simply. "Gay, straight, whatever you are. You're my daughter, and you are perfect. The problem was never you. It was always me." Emma remained silent, processing his words. "The firings, the foundation," he continued, "are not to impress you. They are because I finally understand that my money, my power, mean nothing if I don't use them to do what's right. And abandoning my daughter, kicking you out of the house for who you are, was the worst thing I ever did in my life." He paused, looking directly into her eyes. "Emma, I'm not doing this so you'll forgive me. I'm doing it because I've learned that being your father means protecting and supporting not only you but all children like you who have been rejected by cowardly parents like I was." Emma closed her eyes. silent tears streaming down her face. When she opened them again, there was something different there, not complete forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of something. "You fired Sandra Wellington," she said softly. "Yes. She was awful to me when I worked there for 2 weeks in 2020, before the diagnosis. She called me misfit when she found out I was homeless." Richard clenched his fists. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emma smiled sadly. "Dad, at that time you didn't even know I existed. How could I tell you?" The weight of her words settled between them again, but this time it wasn't just pain, there was also acknowledgement, perhaps even cautious hope. At that moment, Dr. Harris entered the room with a careful smile on her face. "How are you feeling, Emma?" "Stronger," she admitted. "Still tired, but stronger." "Well, I have good news," the doctor said, consulting her tablet. "The latest tests show the experimental treatment is working better than we expected. The tumor masses have shrunk 40% in 6 weeks. Richard jumped out of his chair. "That means?" "It means Emma has a real chance of recovery," Dr. Harris smiled. "It's still a long road, and she will need at least 6 more months of intensive treatment, but we have reason to be cautiously optimistic." Emma looked at her father, seeing tears of relief streaming down his face, and for the first time in 5 years, felt something she had forgotten how to recognize. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was not alone in the world after all. "Dad," she said softly, and he turned to her immediately. "Yes, Princess?" "Thank you," she whispered, "for fighting for me, even when I couldn't fight for myself." And in that moment, in the hospital room bathed in the golden light of a Manhattan sunset, Richard Sterling knew he had found something far more valuable than any corporate empire: a second chance with the person who mattered most in the world. The garden of Mount Sinai Medical Center was covered with a light March snow, the bare branches of the trees beginning to show the first signs of green. Emma, wrapped in a thick coat that Richard had bought for her, sat in a wheelchair near the windows of the recovery center, watching the flakes dance in the air. 3 months had passed since the first experimental treatments. Her hair was starting to grow back, small, dark strands curling shyly around her ears. She had gained 15 pounds, and although still visibly fragile, there was life in her eyes again. Richard approached cautiously, his footsteps crunching on the thin snow in the garden. "Emma," he said softly, "there's someone here who wants to see you." Emma turned her head, curious, and her heart almost stopped. Walking along the stone path, nervous but determined, was Sofia Rodriguez. Her brown hair was shorter now, and there were lines around her eyes that weren't there 5 years ago, but it was definitely her. "Sophia?" Emma whispered, her voice heavy with disbelief. "I am," Sophia said softly, stopping a few feet from the wheelchair, her hands nervously clasped in front of her body. Emma glanced quickly between Sophia and her father, confusion mixed with hope on her face. "How? How did she—" Richard cleared his throat, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. "I found her," he admitted. "I hired a private investigator. It took 3 weeks to track her down to Portland, where she works as an art teacher at an elementary school." Sophia took a step forward, her brown eyes shining with unshed tears. "He called me personally," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He asked to speak with me. At first, I thought it was some kind of cruel prank. And then?" Emma asked, still processing the surreal situation. Richard approached Sophia, his posture formal but respectful. "Sophia," he said, his voice weighted with 3 years of therapy and self-reflection, "I owe you an apology that's 5 years overdue." Sophia looked at him in surprise. "Mr. Sterling, please," he interrupted gently. "Let me speak. When Emma brought you home that night in 2019, I didn't see a brave young woman who loved my daughter. I only saw my own fears and prejudices reflected back at me. I blamed you for influencing Emma, as if loving someone were a contagious disease." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I destroyed your relationship with my daughter," he continued. "I separated 2 people who loved each other because it was easier to blame you than to face my own bigotry, and that was unforgivable." Sophia wiped a tear that ran down her face. "I really loved her," she whispered. "So much." "I know," Richard said sincerely, "and she loved you too. Even on the streets at the hospital, Emma spoke of you, how much she missed you." Emma looked at her father with new surprise. During all these months of recovery, they had spoken about many things, but he had never mentioned Sophia spontaneously. "I didn't bring Sophia here to force anything," Richard continued, looking directly at Emma. "I brought her because I realized that when I took you from home, I didn't just destroy our family. I destroyed your family too, your life, your relationships. And if there's any chance for you to rebuild anything, my prejudice destroyed." His voice faltered, and he needed a moment to compose himself. "You two deserve that chance," he finished. Sophia approached the wheelchair, kneeling in the snow to be at eye level with Emma. "Em," she said softly, using the intimate nickname she used to use. "I need you to know, leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life." "I know," Emma whispered, extending a trembling hand to touch Sophia's face. "I knew at the time. You couldn't save both of us. Every day for the past 3 years, I've wondered where you were," Sophia confessed, holding Emma's hand against her face. "If you were safe, if you were eating, if you were still alive." "Well," Emma smiled faintly, "technically, I barely was." The two laughed through tears, and Richard watched the moment with a mixture of pain and gratitude. Seeing his daughter laugh genuinely, even if fragile, was like watching the sun rise after years of darkness. "I'll let you two talk," he said softly, beginning to walk away. "Dad," Emma called, making him stop. "Thank you for doing this. I know." "I know it wasn't easy." Richard nodded, his emotions too intense for words, and walked back to the hospital, leaving the two women alone in the quiet garden. 2 hours later, as the sky began to darken, Emma asked Sophia to help her back inside. They found Richard sitting in the waiting room, drinking cold coffee and staring intently at his hands. "Dad," Emma said, and he immediately lifted his eyes. "How was it?" Emma considered the question carefully. "Hard," she admitted, "but necessary. Sophia and we have a lot to talk about, a lot to work through, but—" She looked at Sophia, who smiled encouragingly. "But we're going to try," Emma finished. "Slowly, see if we can find our way back to each other." Richard felt a huge weight lift from his shoulders. "And what about us?" he asked quietly. "Father and daughter." Emma was silent for a long moment, Sophia holding her hand for support. Finally, she sighed deeply. "Dad, sitting here today and seeing you apologize to Sophia, seeing you acknowledge the harm you caused not only me but people you didn't even know, it means more to me than all the charity foundations and expensive treatments in the world." Richard felt his throat tighten. "For months, I wondered if you were doing all this out of guilt or if there really had been changes," Emma continued. "Today I saw the answer." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I forgive you, Dad," she said finally, and the words hit him like a lightning bolt. "Completely. You're no longer the man who kicked me out of the house. You've become the father I always needed you to be." Richard collapsed into the chair, sobs shaking his body as years of guilt and pain finally began to release. "But," Emma continued, her voice firm despite the tears, "forgiveness doesn't erase the past. We can't pretend the 5 years didn't happen. And our relationship, it needs to be built from scratch." "What does that mean?" "It means I need boundaries," she explained. "It means I need space to heal and find who I am now, after everything. It means you can't just step back into being my father like nothing happened." Richard nodded, understanding. "You can be part of my life," Emma continued. "Part of my recovery, part of my future. But it has to be on terms that work for both of us. And sometimes that might mean saying no when your instinct is to fix everything with money or power." "I understand," Richard said quietly. "And Sophia," Emma turned to her ex-girlfriend, "will be part of that equation too. If we're going to try again, then you're going to have to accept that." Richard looked between his daughter and the young woman he had once seen as an enemy, and felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Genuine peace. "All I want," he said finally, "is for you to be happy and healthy. Whatever that looks like, whoever it includes, I'll support it." Emma smiled, and for the first time since she was a child, it reached her eyes completely. "Then let's start over, Dad. Properly this time." And there, in the garden of Mount Sinai Medical Center, with snow falling gently outside and warmth finally returning to their hearts, 3 people began the process of healing years of pain. and building something new from the pieces of what was broken. The apartment in Brooklyn Heights was small compared to the mansion where Emma had grown up, but the golden light of a late September afternoon streaming through the windows made it shine like a real home. Emma was in the kitchen, her hands now steady and healthy seasoning a salmon she had learned to prepare during her months of recovery. Her hair, which had grown into soft curls down to her shoulders, danced as she moved through the kitchen with a lightness that hadn't existed for years. The doorbell rang, and Emma felt a familiar chill in her stomach. 6 months of slow, careful reconciliation had not completely eradicated the nerves that arose before each meeting with her father. But this time was different. This would be the first time Richard and Sophia would have dinner together at her home, the first real family gathering in over 5 years. "Should I get it?" Sophia asked, stepping out of the bedroom where she had been choosing what to wear with the same care she would take when meeting a girlfriend's family for the first time. "Yes, please," Emma replied, wiping her hands on the apron. "It's still strange for me, opening the door and finding him there, knowing he was invited." Sophia kissed her cheek softly before going to the door. When she opened it, Richard Sterling stood in the hallway, holding a bouquet of white peonies and a bottle of red wine, wearing not one of his impeccable suits, but dark jeans and a navy cashmere sweater. "Good evening, Sophia," he said, his voice carrying a genuine cordiality that had been cultivated through months of careful interactions. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Sophia replied, still unable to call him by his first name despite his encouragement. "Richard, please," he said for the 10th time, stepping into the apartment. "And thank you for including me tonight." The apartment was small, but Sophia had helped Emma decorate it carefully. Plants in colorful pots, photographs of happy moments from recovery, a bookshelf full of books that Emma had rediscovered her love for reading. Richard observed every detail with the eyes of a man learning to know his daughter again. "Emma," he called, walking to the kitchen. "How can I help?" "Just relax, Dad," she said, the word coming naturally, without the heavy weight it once carried. "Everything is almost ready." Richard paused for a moment, the sound of Dad still hitting him like an unexpected gift every time she said it. In recent months, Emma had mostly used Richard or Dad. Daddy was reserved for special moments when she felt safe enough to be his daughter again. "The apartment is perfect," he said, looking around with genuine admiration. "You've made it a real home." "Sophia helped me a lot," Emma admitted, looking at her girlfriend affectionately. "She has good taste in decoration." In recent months, Sophia had moved from Portland to Brooklyn, landing a job as an art teacher at a local school. The relationship between her and Emma was slowly being rebuilt, with couples, therapy, and much patience. But there was a solidity there that impressed Richard daily. During dinner, sitting around the small wooden dining table that Richard had insisted on buying for Emma, the conversation flowed in a way that had seemed impossible just a year before. "So, how is the new training initiative going?" Emma asked, delicately cutting her salmon. Richard smiled, his eyes lighting up in a way that Margaret, his secretary, had said she hadn't seen in decades. "Exceptionally well," he answered. "We hired 12 young people last month. Marcus, that trans young man you met last week, is showing incredible talent in programming. I'm thinking of sponsoring his education in computer science." Sophia leaned forward, interested. "And how is the senior team reacting to the changes?" "There was initial resistance," Richard admitted. "Some of the veterans couldn't adapt to the new environment. But those who stayed, they are seeing results. Our productivity has increased by 20% since we started prioritizing inclusion and employee well-being." Emma smiled proudly. "See? I always said treating people with respect is good for business." "You were right," Richard said simply. "You were right about many things." As the night went on, the conversations grew deeper. Richard talked about his last therapy session, where he had told Dr. Mitchell he finally felt ready to graduate from treatment. Sophia spoke about her new students, especially an 8-year-old girl who had confessed she had 2 moms, and felt relieved to discover her teacher thought that was perfectly normal and beautiful. Emma shared about her volunteering at the LGBTQ+ shelter center Richard had founded. "There's this boy," she said, toying with the stem of her wine glass. 16 years old, kicked out of his house for being gay. He reminds me, well, of me, but different. He's proud of who he is. He doesn't apologize for existing. As you should have been, Richard said quietly. Maybe, Emma agreed. But our journey brought us here. And look where we are now. She gestured around the table, to the three of them, father, daughter, and girlfriend, sharing a meal that would have been impossible to imagine 5 years earlier. Sometimes I wonder if the young girl I was would have believed this, she continued. That one day we'd be here, talking about our days. You asking about Sophia like a normal person asks about their daughter's partner. Richard reached out across the table, covering Emma's hand with his. Emma, I want you to know, he began, his voice full of emotion. These past months, watching you recover, build your life, pursue your dreams, it hasn't just been about redeeming myself. It's been about discovering who you really are, when you're not fighting to survive. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. And what did you discover? That you are extraordinary, he said without hesitation. Brave, compassionate, resilient. You are everything I ever wanted a daughter of mine to be, and everything I failed to recognize when I was blinded by prejudice. Daddy, Emma whispered, squeezing his hand. Hearing you call me that, Richard admitted, tears openly flowing now, is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my entire life. Sophia reached over and gently placed her hand over theirs, completing the circle. Emma told me, she said softly, that the tattoo was the first thing that made you remember she was your daughter. Emma automatically reached to the back of her neck, where the letters Daddy were now visible beneath her grown-out hair. For the longest time, I thought about getting it removed, she confessed, during those years when I hated what it represented. And now? Richard asked. Emma looked between her father and her girlfriend, seeing acceptance and love in both their faces. Now, I realize it was never about you being worthy of the title, she said. It was about holding on to hope that someday you would be. And you became that person, Dad. You became the daddy that the 16-year-old girl wanted to honor when she got that tattoo. Richard stood up from his chair and moved toward his daughter, embracing her in a hug that contained 5 years of lost embraces, months of healing, and the promise of forever love. I love you, Emma, he whispered into her hair. My brave, beautiful daughter. I love you too, Daddy, she whispered back. And there, in the small apartment in Brooklyn Heights, with Sophia smiling through happy tears and autumn light filtering through the windows, 3 people who had nearly lost everything to prejudice and pride finally found their way home to each other. The tattoo on Emma's neck, once a symbol of abandonment and rejection, now caught the light as a promise. Some bonds are strong enough to survive even the darkest winters, and love real, unconditional love can bloom again if given a chance to grow.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.